Welcome to this presentation using Zoom technology to bring the West Orange Public Library to you. I want to thank Mr. Jose Romero, the librarian, for bringing this workshop to you. I hope you enjoy it and hold your questions until after the presentation. What is it about Abraham Lincoln that fascinates us more than 200 years after his birth? Lincoln, as you can see, was the central political figure of the 19th century. Lincoln and Andrew Jackson were the two most popular presidents of the 19th century. Lincoln was also considered the most hated president of the 19th century as well. There are more public schools named for Abraham Lincoln than any other president, and more books have been written about Lincoln and his life than any other person in history. He was also the first president to advocate voting rights for women. He established the Thanksgiving holiday, and he is the only president to own a patent, number 6469 in 1849. In life, Abraham Lincoln wrestled with the race question more openly than any other president except perhaps Thomas Jefferson. And unlike Jefferson, Lincoln's actions sometimes matched his words. And sometimes great politicians like Lincoln modified their ideas to appease and to appeal to different audiences. This is the most logical introduction to the development of Lincoln's quest for social justice. Okay, what happened?
No,
Okay, we're good?
yeah, we have another participant.
Okay.
There's nothing on the screen. There you go.
All right.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. By the way, Walt Whitman wrote this elegy to Lincoln in 1865. Whitman was considered the New Age poet of his day. This was the first of two elegies for Lincoln. There are reports that Whitman attended a viewing of Lincoln's body in Washington. He was a great admirer of the president. So, how did Lincoln get to be born in rural Kentucky? First, as an introduction to that, I'm going to play a little theme song for you. I hope everyone was able to see that. It says sharing is paused, but okay. All right, we're back in. Everyone can see the screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Okay. So as one travels south from Louisville, Kentucky, one comes after some 40 miles to a high, steep, craggy elevation known as Muldriggs Hill, through which Knob Creek, a clear, swift-flowing stream, has gouged the pass to make its way to the Rolling Fork. Branched of Knob Creek has cut a deep gorges into the escarpment on either side, eroding out and washing down the limestone to form a small delta-like patches of rich silt at intervals along the stream. One of these fertile patches, 2.5 miles above Rolling Fork, in a place called Hodgenville, Thomas Lincoln had established a homestead where he lived with his wife, Nancy, and their young son and daughter. Farming life was a hard venture for the families along Knob Creek. If it rained too little, there was little produce, and if it rained too hard, the rushing water might carry the corn and pumpkin seeds straight down to the river and be washed away. This is the kind of life that Abraham Lincoln, who would become the 16th president of the United States, was born on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin just south of Hodgenville, Kentucky. Abe Lincoln's grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, was a successful farmer in Virginia who lived near the farm owned by the family of Daniel Boone, the explorer. The elder Lincoln and Boone were cousins, and after hearing the stories of the beautiful land in the Western Territories, he decided to move his family to Kentucky in 1782, when Thomas was about 4 years old. Abraham was killed in an Indian ambush in 1786. Thomas's older brother killed a Native American who was attempting to kidnap young Thomas from the family farm. By the time Thomas was 16, he was drifting in and around Elizabethtown, Kentucky, earning a living as a carpenter and buying up small lots of farmland. In 1806, Thomas Lincoln married Nancy Hanks. Their daughter Sarah was born in 1807 and Abraham in 1809. Now it's interesting that you see a picture of the log cabin. There is a story behind this log cabin. In 1811, the Lincolns moved 10 miles to a new farm. The original cabin no longer existed. Most of the logs were recycled by other farmers and into other structures. So the original log cabin doesn't exist. In 1895, a New York real estate developer, Alfred Dennett, purchased the farm and had a log cabin replica built on the site. Dennett tried to pass this structure off as the original log cabin, and in 1897, it was dismantled and it was reassembled for the 1897 Tennessee Centennial Exposition in Nashville, the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, and then it was put on display in Coney Island, Brooklyn, around 1905. Robert Collier of Collier's Weekly Magazine acquired the Hodgenville farm. He purchased the disassembled logs for $1,000 and shipped them to Kentucky. Along the way, the train stopped numerous times so people could touch the logs, perpetuating the log cabin myth. The replica was reassembled in Louisville, Kentucky in June of 1906, and it was open to the public, but it had to be disassembled 1 week later because visitors were cutting pieces of it for souvenirs. The replica log cabin was reassembled in 1909 in Hodgeville, Kentucky, for the Lincoln Centennial. President Theodore Roosevelt laid the cornerstone for a museum that would eventually house the replica, although the myth that the logs were original persisted. The National Park Service has operated the museum since 1911. Interestingly, the replica log cabin was 18 feet by 18 feet, similar to the log cabin Thomas lived in in 1806 to 1811. But the replica cabin was shrunk to 12 by 17, so it would fit inside the museum. The National Park Service continues to pretend that the logs are real. For example, it prohibits flash photography, but only in small print do they call the structure traditional and not original. This is a picture of the United States in 1803. Kentucky was a slave state, and it was hard for the Lincolns to survive because they belonged to a Baptist church that held restrictive views on alcohol, dancing, and slavery. They could not compete with area farms who relied on slave labor. In 1816, the family moved to eastern Indiana. Lincoln's realization of the basic humanity of African Americans derives from his father, who moved the family to Indiana, partly because he disliked the racial slavery that was sanctioned in Kentucky. Lincoln was also appalled by shackled slaves he was forced to transport while working on a river steamboat in 1841. So here's a little bit about Lincoln's family, his parents. Nancy Lincoln, his mother, died in 1818 of milkweed disease. She drank milk from a cow who had accidentally eaten this poisonous weed. Thomas then returns to Elizabeth, Kentucky, and marries a widow, Sarah Johnson, and brings her and her 3 children to Indiana. Sarah teaches the 9-year-old Abraham to read. Abraham rarely attends school, but is enamored with books and is a voracious reader. Financially, the family is in difficulty, so they acquire a farm in Illinois, a free state where the milkweed disease was not a factor. By now, Abe Lincoln is a young adult and splits with his family, settling first in New Salem and then in Springfield, Illinois. He begins to read law books, he clerks for a lawyer, and eventually he passes the Illinois State Bar in 1836. Okay. Here's a map of Kentucky, and it shows the Lincolns coming to Virginia, then to Indiana, and then to Illinois. Now, Abraham Lincoln, his stepmother, Sarah, who taught him how to read, he last sees her in 1861 as he leaves to go to Washington to assume the presidency. So here's a little bit about his family. Lincoln met and married Mary Todd Lincoln in 1842 in Springfield. They had 4 children. Robert was the only child to become an adult. He was a Harvard graduate, a corporate lawyer in Chicago, and he had 3 children. His great-grandson, Robert Beckwith, who died in 1965, was the last living descendant of Abraham Lincoln. Edward died in 1850 of tuberculosis. Willie died in 1862 of fever. And Thomas, Tad, died in 1871 of heart failure. Okay. Now, the Republican Convention of 1860, the Republican Party was formed in the antebellum period of American history. The Whig Party was taken over by a mix of free soilers, different factions, free soilers, and other splinter groups. The Republican Party emerged in the 1850s as the liberal wing of American politics, the anti-slavery party. Lincoln was a political unknown outside of Illinois until he debated Stephen Douglas in a run for the Senate in 1858, which was reported in detail by the New York Times. Because of that, he was invited to give a speech in New York City at Cooper Union in February of 1860, and suddenly Lincoln was a nationally known person. By the way, at the convention in 1860, Lincoln was nominated on the 3rd ballot, and Senator Hamlin of Maine was nominated as the vice president. Lincoln served in the Illinois legislature and 1 term in Congress in 1847 to 49. In 1860, Lincoln was nominated for president at the Republican convention on the third ballot. The Democratic Party split among regional issues. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, and the Southern Democrats nominated the Vice President, John Breckinridge. They split the vote. And of course, Lincoln was elected president. This is a picture of the cabinet, Lincoln's cabinet. And the gentleman standing in the military uniform was General Winfield Scott, who was general of the Army at the time Lincoln took the oath of office. Scott resigned shortly thereafter, and he was replaced by George McClellan, who was eventually replaced by Ulysses S. Grant. Now, McClellan and Lincoln did not get along, and in fact, McClellan ran for president as a Democrat in the 1864 election. Now, upon Lincoln's election in 1860, 11 states formally seceded from the Union to form the Confederacy. Lincoln had very little practical experience in military operations. Lincoln served as a volunteer in the Illinois militia for about 4 months during the Black Hawk War in 1832. He saw no combat, but was elevated to captain of his first company. Before mustering out, Lincoln was assigned to burial duties of soldiers who died in the combat. The Civil War was supposed to be over quickly, but after several miscalculations and leadership problems, the Union Army forced the Confederacy to surrender on April 9th, 1865. So even though Lincoln lacked the experience, he believed very strongly in the Union, in the American Union. But we may all agree on the causes of the Civil War, but was it waged only to preserve the Union, or for a higher moral authority to end slavery? Or was it an economic war? That's a question we have to ponder. If Lincoln wanted to abolish slavery and had campaigned on that promise, why didn't he emancipate slaves when he took office in March of 1861? The answer is very complicated. Lincoln understood that fighting a war for freedom was ideologically more satisfying than fighting simply to preserve a moral neutral Union. To save the Union, it was necessary to find rationales for the war other than to save the Union. And that's the intention of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation has been hailed by some historians as the single most revolutionary document ever signed by an American president. Abraham Lincoln stated that the Emancipation Proclamation was the central act of my administration. But what did it really do? Did it free the slaves? Did it change social welfare policy? Was it a political tool in Lincoln's upcoming re-election campaign? Well, let's look at the facts and decide if the Emancipation Proclamation did what it intended to do. The language of the Emancipation Proclamation is not altogether clear. It created freedom for slaves that were not under the jurisdiction of the United States, and here's why. First, Lincoln wanted to abolish slavery in the United States. He was committed to that course of action. And I think Lincoln evolved to this belief because you remember, when he was a legislator in Illinois, he did not oppose the state transit provisions. In fact, he represented a slaveholder, and his father-in-law owned slaves. And when he died, the slaves were sold, and Abraham and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, both benefited from the sale of those slaves. So even though Illinois was a, quote, free state, they had these transit laws. The transit laws were about that if a slaveholder in a state where slaves were legal owned farmland or owned land in a free state in Illinois, he was allowed to bring slaves onto that farm to work the land as long as they didn't stay there for more than 365 days at a time. So many slaveholding landowners who owned land in Illinois would take their slaves back after 1 year and then bring them back after a day. Okay. So under the provisions of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, there was a firewall between federal and state authority. While the states could not overrule or nullify a federal law, the federal government could make no laws about anything unless it was given the permission to do so in the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution does not grant the president the power to do anything they please, even for the best of reasons. After Lincoln was elected, 11 states seceded from the Union and created their own independent country, the Confederate States of America, in part to preserve slavery. 4.5 million of the approximately 5 million slaves lived in those 11 states. The other states lived in the 4 border states of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, states that had chosen not to secede. Lincoln believed that the founding fathers, in writing the Declaration of Independence and ratifying the Constitution, thought that slavery would eventually die out. However, during Lincoln's pre-presidential career, the opposite became true. While opposed to slavery, Lincoln abided by the rule of law. In Illinois, for example, slavery was prohibited with that very large loophole, as I explained before. Okay. So Lincoln may have been opposed to slavery, but he felt no obligation to create an egalitarian society. On his inauguration day, Lincoln took the oath of office to uphold and protect the Constitution. He was a lawyer and he believed in the rule of law. On March 6, 1857, 4 years before Lincoln's inauguration, Chief Justice Roger Taney and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. And they ruled that African Americans were not eligible for citizenship and as such could not bring a suit into federal court. It also ruled that slavery was reserved to the rights of the states and that the federal government had no jurisdiction, and that Congress had no right to exclude slavery in any U.S. territory. So, when Lincoln took office in 1861, most slaves were not residing in the United States, and Lincoln had no power to abolish slavery in the 4 border states because slavery was a states' rights issue. So upon assuming office, Lincoln came up with a brilliant plan, or so he thought. He would begin a process to influence the 4 border states to abolish slavery. Remember, Lincoln was skating on thin ice, and he didn't want to push those border states into joining the Confederacy. So he began by approaching the state legislature of Delaware and offered the state $700,000 in compensation if the state abolished slavery, about $400 per slave. Once the Delaware legislature abolished slavery, slave owners could accept the compensation, or they could sell their slaves to Maryland slave owners. Lincoln wanted to create a domino effect. He theorized that once Delaware abolished slavery, those slave owners would be free, would flood the market with slaves, increasing the supply. It would make it easier for Lincoln to then go to the Maryland legislature and offer the same buyout. Then to Missouri, and then Kentucky. Once the war ended and the Confederacy disbanded, he could simply declare all the slaves free, and his job would be accomplished. He would force each Southern state legislature to either abolish slavery or continue to be governed by a federally appointed territorial governor. Lincoln told his cabinet that he was very confident his compensation plan would work. Lincoln could also have declared martial law in the border states, but that may have forced those states into seceding into the Confederacy. But the buyout plan had problems. First, the Delaware legislature refused to cooperate. Their slaveholders told legislators that they were not ready to give up slavery. And then Delaware received pressure from Kentucky and Missouri to decline the compensation plan, so to preserve their slave economy. Abraham Lincoln was left with very few options. He could push through Congress a constitutional amendment which would overturn the Dred Scott decision. That would take time, and state ratification would only affect Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And again, he wanted to avoid those states into seceding. So the creative Lincoln played with the idea of slowly offering some African Americans a chance to be free. Lincoln could not, by law, emancipate the slaves in the Union. Lincoln could not physically emancipate the slaves in the South. They were in another country. But he could emancipate slaves residing in occupied territories, Southern territories where Northern troops had overtaken. He could also encourage slaves to run away from their Southern masters to occupied territories and enlist in the Union Army. They would then be emancipated. So he was trying to create a little rebellion. Since emancipation was Lincoln's deepest desire, he proclaimed the Emancipation Proclamation, knowing full well it had little effect on freeing most slaves. By the time the war ended in 1865, Congress was ready to pass the 13th Amendment, ending formal slavery. The Senate passed it in April of 1864, the House in January of 1865. Unfortunately, Lincoln died before it was ratified. It was ratified on December 6th, 1865. Note that the 13th Amendment is the only amendment to the Constitution signed by a sitting president. Amendments to the Constitution are not required to be signed by the president. There's also a note that here's an interesting note. New Jersey initially rejected the ratification of the 13th Amendment in March of 1865, and there's a whole story behind that. And if someone asks me a question about that, I can explain why. But then it did ratify it when it was represented to the legislature in January of 1866. Mississippi was the last state to ratify the 13th Amendment. It ratified it on March 16th, 1995. But the certification to the federal government was lost. And it was only received in Washington on February 7th, 2013. So Lincoln was assassinated on April 15th, 1865. The assassination was part of a larger conspiracy to eliminate other high-ranking members of the Lincoln administration. John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, was killed on April 26th while trying to escape his hideout. And on July 7th, 1865, 4 of the remaining conspirators were executed and 4 were sentenced to life in prison. And there you see a picture of John Wilkes Booth of Ford's Theater. A great trivia question is, what was the name of the play? And I'm sure many of you remember, I think it was My American Cousin was the play that they attended. And that's the pistol, the Derringer, that was used by Booth. Okay. Now, Lincoln had a great legacy. You see pictures of the Lincoln penny, Lincoln logs, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And also you see, there's a picture of John F. Kennedy riding in a Lincoln Continental.
Oh, yeah.
And here are some more images of Lincoln on postage stamps. And of course, Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and George Washington are chiseled onto the face of Mount Rushmore. So I have a question: who would be your choice for Mount Rushmore today? And we can have that as a discussion. So here's a bibliography. This the Gilda Lerman website is a wonderful website for all American history. And if you're an American history buff, then I recommend that. Doris Kearns Goodwin has written what I believe one of the best books on Lincoln. And Alan Guelzo, he's a professor at Gettysburg College and is a world-renowned Lincoln scholar. And of course, James Lowen, who wrote 2 books, Lies My Teacher Told Me and Lies Across America, which are great in busting the myths of not only Lincoln, but of many famous people in American history. So that's my program. And I'm open for questions.
I have a question on his second inaugural speech. It seems like that one is a really important speech that he makes, and it's in the movie Lincoln.
Okay, I'm not familiar. I did see them did it, but since I'm not familiar with it right now, I don't have it in front of me. What,
Right.
Jose? What is?
Well, the thing is that with, the Civil War, all the death and destruction, and I think the reason why people love it is because even with all that an animosity between the South, he, in his inaugural speech, he basically says, let's come together. Let's. I mean,
Right.
all that devastation that happened, for him to still extending his arms to the people, and trying to push that people come together is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, and if you look at the context of the Gettysburg Address, which is very short, but it really addresses itself to that issue. Remember, it was given at the cemetery in Gettysburg a few months after the end of the Gettysburg campaign and towards the end of the war. And it's really was in front of the burial ground where the soldiers of that battle were buried. And he talks about, the Union and bringing the Union together. So to me, that's one of Lincoln's great speeches as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Is the Ford Theater building still in existence?
It is. It's an operating theater. Yes.
Okay. They never did make a museum out of it?
I was there once, like 30 years ago, and they had a small little museum. I don't know what it does today, but I do know that they operate plays there.
Okay, thank you.
Sam, what did you think about the movie that Spielberg did on Lincoln?
That was very good. It was very good, but I thought it was very accurate, especially the parts, that there were several assassination attempts on Lincoln, including, if you notice in the film, he had a summer home not far outside of Washington. It was actually a government naval hospital, I believe, that where he had a summer home. And coming back from that summer home, he declined to take a carriage, instead rode horseback back to Washington. But his wife took the carriage, and someone had loosened the lug nuts on the carriage, and the carriage had an accident. The wheels came off. She was injured, and in fact, she had headaches for the rest of her life because of the injury she sustained in that assassination attempt. And I believe that was in the movie. They showed that in the movie.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So it's very active. Lincoln was tormented. It's interesting that when he died, there was a huge funeral procession going for a couple of weeks through various cities, including New York City. There's a photograph of the funeral procession going through New York City, and a picture in the window of Teddy Roosevelt as a 10-year-old watching the procession.
Wow.
Interesting, they didn't have any embalming science, and the body kept getting darker as it decomposed. They didn't know about ice, so every day they would put makeup on Lincoln's face to prevent him from from the body decomposing. Interestingly, his son Tad, who died while Lincoln was president, was temporarily buried in Washington, but in the procession, in the carriage that took the president, Tad was underneath there because they were both going to be buried in Springfield. So that was an interesting little piece of information. I found that as well.
When was
Go ahead.
when was the Lincoln Memorial?
Okay, that Lincoln Memorial was built during the Depression because it was built with WPA funds during.
And who was the person that instigated that? You don't know.
Well, I assume it was Franklin Roosevelt, and because it was built, that's when it was built. Yeah, using people who put to work because of the Depression.
Yeah, Depression.
So as I said, there's so much written about Lincoln, so much, and there's a lot of. I've read a couple of books that are really terrible, that really poke fun at Americans' fascination with Lincoln, but I think they're pretty much crackpots because every scholar, there are some great scholars in academia who have written tremendous biographies and other books about Lincoln.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Oops, where's our phone?
Oh, no,
That's my
you have set aside my quest for social justice when it comes to Lincoln because he's just revered in my family.
Yeah. And there are lots of myths too about him as well. And I've tried to, check out all the myths,
Right.
Especially the myth that he owned slaves, which he did not.
Right. And that's something right now that people are really concerned about. Some of our leaders that might have had, slaves.
Right. So the conclusion is that the Emancipation Proclamation was political expediency. It helped him get reelected as president, but it really did very little. And it wasn't law. it was just a proclamation. So
Right, and
because of
and
that firewall.
right, and that discussion in the movie about, you know, needing to pass that amendment in his second term, how important it was, because the proclamation was just, you're right, it was just
Right. And you know, there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment.
I didn't know
Where if you were convicted of a crime, you could be sent to a um, uh, slave type of chain gang. And in the South, that's how they continued slavery. They would pick African Americans up for petty violations, and they would force them into these chain gangs without due process. And of course, I could do a whole lecture on Reconstruction America, which ended, by the way, in an interesting presidential election, I think in 1874, maybe. Samuel Tilden against Harrison. I think that's it. Where Tilden actually won the popular votes. The Democrat, Samuel Tilden was the Democrat. He won the popular vote. Was it Harrison? I can't remember. Maybe, no, I'm sorry. It was Rutherford Hayes. So he won the popular vote, and he was about to win by one vote the Electoral College, but then 30 votes, 30 Electoral College votes were challenged. Okay, so he didn't have a majority in the Electoral College. Southern Democrats went to Hayes and said that if we can move those 30 electoral votes to you, would you end Reconstruction? And he agreed. And that's how Hayes won that election. He actually stole that election. And that's a little known fact in American history.
Right.
You can look up.
Sam, one final question on my end. Did Lincoln state after the Civil War that African Americans would get land and mule?
Oh, you mean 5 acres and a mule, something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, that was Lincoln had already died, but that was part of Reconstruction, and yes, remember the war ended in April 9th, and Lincoln was killed the week after. So everything was after the war, but yes, and I think that was part of Reconstruction.
Okay.
5 acres and a mule, right? But that was also to open up the territories. You get into this thing with the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act in antebellum. Stephen Douglas, we know because he debated Lincoln and because he ran for president and he was a senator, but he wanted to open up railroads through coast-to-coast railroads, and he wanted the terminus to be in Chicago, see, because he had financial interest in doing that. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he pushed through Congress in order to start construction on a transcontinental railroad ending in Chicago. And so Douglas is a very powerful man, but it also ended the career of President Pierce. Pierce is the only president who didn't receive the nomination from his party to run for a second term. So
Wow.
that went to, he was pushed out of office by James Buchanan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because of this Kansas-Nebraska Act, which essentially overturned the Missouri Compromise. But so, again, I could do a whole lecture on that.
Sam, we're expecting more from you.
Well, let's hope that I can do it inside the library too, and I get a lot.
Yes, yes, exactly, Sam. But, again, I want to thank you for
You're very welcome. I hope you
your
enjoyed it.
presentation. Yes, and does any comments from the gallery? Louis?
He's got on mute.
I think they muted.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, I'm an immigrant just trying to refresh my American history. We'll learn it in grade school, but never when you are seated in the right place at the right time.
Well, good. If you have any questions, send them to Jose, and he can send them to me, and I'll be happy to answer them. Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Very good.
All right, take care.
Bye, Jose.
All right,
Nice to
Ms.
meet
Bernstein, take care.
you. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, here we go. Let's see how we gonna end this baby right here.
That's all right.